I'm Adam Tanner. In my professional life, I'm a writer and I'm also a journalist and a lecturer, but my great passion is music. And one of my great musical passions is Indian classical music and the sitar in particular. So I've come to the foothills of the Himalayan mountains where I am right now. I'm in a place called Sikkim, the province of India, and a place in Sikkim called Gangtok, and I'm at the Burpeepal estate. In 1967, the Beatles also came to the foothills of the Himalayan mountains, a different part of the country, and they wanted to renovate themselves spiritually, but also musically. Their visit to India in 1967 had a profound impact on their music. And in turn, people in the West became very aware of Indian music and the sitar in particular. And to some extent, the sitar and Indian classical sounds became part of the soundtrack of the 1960s in a way that even today, when you hear movies and TV shows that refer back to the 60s, you may hear the clanging of the sitar that sounds of the tabla. So I want to explain a little what Indian classical music is about. It's such a nice setting coming to the Himalayas, or the foothills of the Himalayas, because it's very peaceful. Many Indian cities are known for being very busy, sometimes chaotic to the visitor, but here it's very peaceful. And in fact, right now, I'm heading down to the riverside to play some sitar. So learning Indian classical music has its complications. You typically have a guru or a teacher, and you must devote yourself to the teacher in a way that would be different or unusual for many Western students. You must do what the teacher says, and in an Indian context, you would live with the teacher. The approach I take, of course, is I'm not fully living in India. I don't have time to fully devote to a guru. So from time to time, I'm learning from a professional musician. And here in India, I've been learning from one of the best, and you'll meet him shortly. But I've also had the chance to study with Ali Akbar Khan, who's one of the great classical musicians of the 20th century. He was the brother-in-law of Ravi Shankar, the great sitarist. And in his class setting, it was quite interesting. You could never ask questions. There would be a grand group of students, 20 or 30 sitting in front of him. He would be sitting on the dais above. He would be singing or playing the music, and the students would replicate what he had to say or what he had to sing, but there was no questions. This is Indian classical music. The guru will never be questioned. So it's a tough enterprise to learn Indian classical music, but for me, it's been extremely rewarding. I've just been here about 10 days studying with my guru, Sanjay, and he told me I should be practicing 8 hours a day. Now, when I told him that was a little impractical with my lifestyle, given that I have another job and a real life to live other than music, he said, okay, we will reduce it to 3 hours a day, and he prepared an extensive plan. The point of all of this, that for Indian musicians, music is what you do. You don't casually come upon Indian classical music and do it as a hobby. You devote yourself fully to the profession. And that's why, interestingly, there's not that many casual Indian musicians. Either you're fully dedicated to your instrument, the sitar, the sarod, the bansuri flute, perhaps as a vocalist, as a singer, or you don't play at all. And so the incidence of casual players in India is quite rare. Of course, for a Western musician, it's hard. I'm only casually playing, but I have to do the best I can to please him. Otherwise, he won't continue my lesson. After the Beatles came back from India in 1967, they recorded the White Album, one of their best-known albums. And many of the songs on the White Album were inspired by their time in India, even if they're not specifically Indian-sounding songs. after that exposure, more and more musicians became interested in India, and Ravi Shankar in particular, the tutor of George Harrison, came to very many classical concerts in the United States. He played at Woodstock, he played at the Monterey Pop Festival, and that in turn interested a whole generation of Americans and Europeans as well in Indian classical music. Sometimes in a way that he did not find appealing. He did not like the fact that people took drugs or got drunk or were making out with their girlfriends during the concert, but he was able to expose millions of people in the West to Indian classical music in a way that had never been done before. And that is what many of us remember to this day. Thanks to Ravi Shankar, the inspiration of Indian classical music came to the West. So nowadays, when you can see almost any music instantly on YouTube or via the internet, it might seem less phenomenal to hear music from a far-off land. But in the 1970s and 1960s, when Indian classical music became popular in Western culture, this was something unusual at the time, and the amount of exposure that the sitar in particular received with Ravi Shankar's celebrity was something unusual. It died down later in the 1970s and 1980s, but till this day, you will hear quite frequently in movie soundtracks and advertising commercials, tabla, the Indian drums. You might hear sitar, and especially when they do flashback scenes of the 1960s, it's come to represent the soundtrack of that flower power hippie era. That's not really what Indian classical music is. That's what many in the West associate it with, but it's the reason that we come to know the music, or for many of us in the West, that's how we know the music. There's lots more to Indian classical music, and I'd invite you to explore how that came to be and some of the beautiful music, not only the sitar, which I play, but the flute, the sarod, another stringed instrument, and vocal music, which is quite interesting. So thank you for tuning in and hearing a little bit about Indian classical music.